Yes, there's a Monty Python reference. I'll be right back. Gracious gang, welcome to another episode of the Gracious Guest Show. I'm your host, Mike Creavey, and I am delighted that you've stopped by today. If you have not checked out this channel before, if you're new to the YouTube channel, please go ahead and subscribe. I got a lot of great stuff here and more great stuff coming in the future on the Shroud of Turin, but on lots of other stuff as well. And just a whole rich variety of things here at the intersection of faith and culture. History, just life experiences and travel and literature and movies, all kinds of different stuff around here, even Star Wars on occasion. So I've got all kinds of stuff for you here on the Gracious Guest Show, and I am delighted to, again, be with you today. Justin Robinson joins us today from Great Britain. He is a coin expert with Samler Husett Group, and he has been on the show before to talk about specifically the face on Byzantine coins that looks very, very similar to the face on the Shroud of Turin, which, again, if the 1988 carbon dating is correct, should be impossible. So today, though, we're going to take a closer look at connections between the Shroud of Turin, the Mandylion or the Edessa image, and this possible source material for the various lore surrounding the Holy Grail and the Arthurian legend where that becomes so prominent as well. So this is a very interesting set of things that we get into here, and I know you're really going to enjoy it. So let's jump right into the interview with Justin Robinson talking about the Shroud and the Grail. Let's do this. All right, Justin Robinson, welcome back to the Gracious Guest Show. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Well, and last time we had you on talking about it's related, all of these things intersect, of course, when talking about the Shroud, but talking specifically about the Byzantine coin connection potentially. And I think it was, I'm pretty sure that in that interview, you had just mentioned in passing as a sort of a placeholder for this conversation, it seems, this idea of the connection between the Shroud and the Holy Grail. And since then, I mean, I haven't done a lot of research, but I've been digging around a little bit, checking out some stuff on YouTube, some of which seems more credible than others. but I thought we could just dive right into this and kind of pick up where we left off and just see if you want to kick off wherever you want here with what this connection is.
Yeah, I think it's one that has always fascinated me. The Holy Grail is probably more well known in society than the Shroud of Turin. You think of the Indiana Jones movie and obviously Dan Brown's novel and the best-selling The Da Vinci Code. Right. It's the interest in the Holy Grail, I think, is very high, and I do sincerely believe from the work that I've done, but really building on the work of the people like Ian Wilson and Barbara Frail and people who've done a huge amount of research into the subject, that if we can make a very solid case for the Shroud of Turin actually being in the custody of the Knights Templar, then I think we have a very, very credible explanation for the Holy Grail story. I've always believed that every myth, every legend will have a kernel of truth in there somewhere. And when we look at the Holy Grail and what the Holy Grail is, the legend that's been passed down to us, the one name that is associated with the Holy Grail is, of course, Joseph of Arimathea. And according to the legend, the Holy Grail is the cup. And Joseph of Arimathea went and took the cup that Jesus had actually poured the wine into during the Last Supper, and he took it to Golgotha, to Calvary, and used it to catch the blood of Jesus in the cup. And so this was the vessel that actually contained the blood of Jesus. Now, what's really interesting about Joseph of Arimathea is when you actually look, he actually appears in all four of the gospel records in the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all mention him, and he literally just has a sentence. I mean, that's all he's given, really, a sentence or two to say that he was the one who took Jesus's body down off the cross. He went to Pilate after the crucifixion and asked permission to actually take down the body of Christ. Mark adds a little bit to that. In Mark chapter 15, we see that Joseph bought a long sheet of clean linen cloth, and then he took Jesus' body down from the cross, wrapped it in the cloth, and laid it in his own tomb that had been carved out of the rock. So this is Joseph of Arimathea's moment, and all four gospel writers considered it important enough to mention him by name and to mention what he did. So his association is with this burial cloth, which Mark actually tells us he went out and purchased. Now that's significant as well, because we know that Joseph of Arimathea is described as being a very wealthy man. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, the secret council, the Jewish council. He was a very prominent member and very important member of that. And so immediately you have an interesting association, because the Grail links, the Grail legend is firmly established with Joseph of Arimathea, and yet here we have this account of him in the Bible as being the owner, the purchaser of the linen shroud that was used to wrap Jesus' body. So you go on from that, and then you have to start asking yourself, well, the Grail is described as being a vessel. It only became a dish or a goblet later on. A vessel, of course, is something that is used to carry something else. So then you're looking at something that would have carried the blood of Jesus. Now, the idea of Joseph of Arimathea walking up to the Roman guards who were executing Jesus and saying, "Would you mind if I just use this cup, please? Because I just want to go over there and catch some drops of his blood in my cup." That is just absolutely just wouldn't happen. So you think, well, how else would Joseph of Arimathea have ended up collecting the blood of Jesus? And the answer is, of course, is that when he wrapped his the body in his bloody body in the shroud, of course there was transference of blood onto the cloth. So immediately you have this this sort of very interesting sort of connection. And I must be honest, I'm always fascinated when things seem to sort of link up like that. And I thought, well, yes, that seems to be a very interesting sort of theory, and it's certainly. I think the most plausible theory for how the Grail got started, because the Grail, according to the Grail legend, of course, it was the Knights Templar that secretly guarded the Holy Grail and kept it safe and protected it. And certainly the latest research, the ongoing research that's being done, would suggest that it is the Knights Templar that actually had possession of the Holy Grail after 1204, when Constantinople was sacked by the Crusaders. So immediately you've got a sort of a marriage there of myth and history, sort of coming together in a very, I think, quite an elegant solution. Now,
sure,
we cannot start talking about myths and legends without throwing in a disclaimer. I mean, obviously, this is all very subject to interpretation, and I'm sure there may be people watching this that will disagree completely. But I think that I like to follow the evidence. I like to follow the historical accounts and see where it goes. And I think that's certainly what we can do. And thanks to, and again, I'm claiming no credit whatsoever for the research that's been done on this subject. Ian Wilson has produced a masterful study of the connection between the Knights Templar, and that appears to be supported with some of the new evidence that we're finding about the Templars' initiation rites, things like that, from the Catholic Church that have been preserved in the Vatican archives.
Right, and I want to get to that, because I have this, some of my background here, prep for this, I guess, was just this, an article I discovered that you had put together, and I have it linked below, unless, well, I can check with you too if there's other things you want me to share after we get off here, but from coinsandhistoryfoundation.org, there was an article that had gone into some of the stuff we spoke about before, but
sure.
It was, I thought, a pretty good summary of, like you said at the outset, this question of, we have this cloth in Turin in Italy, known as the Shroud of Turin, that we have records in Turin back to, is it 1578? If I remember correctly. But
what's
to
that? Sorry,
as far as right, I mean, in terms of how long it's been in Turin.
Oh yes, I'm sorry, since the 16th century. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Right, and then we have the records back to Lire in France. Like we have a pretty good.
It was 1578. That's right. The Savoy family moved the Shroud to Turin, and of course it's been there ever since. Yeah.
But we take it, that specific cloth that people can go and visit if it's on display. Yes. Like we know for sure where it's been one way or the other since at least the 1340s, give or take.
Yes.
And then we're looking at this parallel story of this cloth, the Edessa cloth, the Mandylion, from 525, I believe, up until 1204. And this, just to recap for folks here, this question keeps coming back to: is this the same cloth? That was missing from 1204 till 1340, give or take. And so just to recap that for folks.
And I think it's and again, as you say, this is the key story. I mean, there are some interesting features about the Edessa cloth. The Edessa cloth has its own sort of legend and story attached to it, or the Mandylion as it was known. It was said to be an image not made by human hands. Interestingly enough, all of the depictions of the Mandylion that we have show the face only, which has led some people to speculate that it was just a face. If it was on a piece of cloth, it couldn't then have been the shroud. But we also know that the Edessa cloth also was known. It was often kept folded, and if you actually fold the Shroud of Turin, what you do in a way that just makes the face visible, you actually have a long landscape strip of linen with the face then in the center, and that is exactly how the shroud is. How the image of Edessa is depicted. It's always very interesting, because when you actually see depictions of it, it will be in this. It looks like a frame with a sort of a trellis and a circle cut into the frame to actually display the face. So again, it doesn't necessarily rule itself out completely. The Mandylion, or the Edessa cloth, was also referred to as and I'm going to read this off the screen, the tetradiplon. Tetradiplon, that was the name that was given to it, and that actually means folded in four. Right. So suddenly you have this idea that if you fold this cloth in four, then this is what you have. Again, it was that the Mandylion, as it was said, to bear an image of Christ not made by human hands, a bearded figure, of a person with long hair, center parting, a long nose, large owl-like eyes, and a forked beard. Very much the quintessential image of Jesus, if you like, that we have today. And certainly when you look at the work that's been done, I mean, prior to the Mandylion's rediscovery, as you said, in the early 6th century, Christ was depicted all over the place, sometimes with curly hair, sometimes with bearded, sometimes clean-shaven. And then it seems that around the 6th century, there was a consensus very rapidly took hold, which then spread through the Christian world, that Jesus was going to be depicted with the long beard, the forked beard, the center parting, the long nose, and all of the characteristics, shall we say, of the Edessa of the image of the Mandylion. Now, again, sort of moving on from that, although it was only depicted in Edessa as a face cloth, we also get these tantalizing glimpses that there was actually more going on. So, for example, we have a sermon attributed to Pope Stephen III, and he stated, strangely, that Christ had, quote, spread out his entire body on a linen cloth that was white as snow. And he goes on to say, on this cloth, marvelous as it is to see, the glorious image of the Lord's face and the length of his entire and most noble body has been divinely transferred. Now, this is, again, an indication that what we were seeing, the Edessa cloth, there was more to it than certainly just a face. But there seems to have been a consensus, certainly amongst the senior people who would have had the opportunity to have examined it close up, that there was more than just a face. And also, of course, we know what happened to the Mandylion, because in 943 AD, an army from the Byzantine Empire came to Edessa, which was now under Muslim rule. And against the wishes of the people of Edessa, the Muslim leadership agreed to exchange their famous cloth for 200 high-ranking Muslim prisoners. And so the cloth was actually brought from Edessa, which is in modern Turkey. It was then brought to Constantinople, which of course is now Istanbul. And we even know the date that it arrived in Constantinople. It actually arrived on August the 15th, 944 AD, amidst huge celebration. It was supposedly a phenomenal moment, and the church, it was considered too holy to be put on public display. But there was a sermon that was actually preached by the Archdeacon Gregory the following day with the cloth in front of him. It was actually placed onto. I've got the details here. It was actually placed during the ceremony. It was actually put on the emperor's throne. It was crowned with the emperor's crown, and standing next to the linen cloth, Gregory actually pointed out some features in his sermon, which has been captured. So he actually says here, and I'm quoting, "The splendour has been impressed uniquely by the drops of agony sweat sprinkled from the face. These are truly the beauties that produce the colouring of Christ's imprint, which has been embellished further by the drops of blood sprinkled from his own side. Blood and water there, sweat and image here." And so he's actually pointing these details out in his sermon. And his reference there to the side suggests that this was more than just a face. This obviously had a side as well, and you could actually see the blood stains in the side. And it's a lovely image. I mean, you actually have the Archdeacon there at Constantinople talking about blood and water there, sweat and image here. So again,
and is he distinguishing there, Justin? The wording there, and I might be reading into it. I just want to check.
No.
Does it sound like he's distinguishing between the blood, for example, and the image as because some people see it, I'll talk to my students and they'll at first maybe think that the image is somehow created by the blood, and we
sure
we explain that no, they're distinct. So I'm wondering if that's possibly part of that.
Yeah, no, the two are very distinct, and Gregory I think makes, which I suppose was a very sort of understandable. Gregory's believing here that it's the sweat that has caused the image to form, which again they could see that it wasn't a pigment. There wasn't any paint that had actually created the image. So they've drawn the conclusion, or he's drawn the conclusion there, that this must have something to do with the sweat that poured from Jesus. We know, I mean, interestingly enough, talking about the image, we know that, as you say, it wasn't formed by blood. I think one of the most fascinating things about the Shroud of Turin, which I always challenge sort of people when I'm talking about it, is that, of course, the image does not form under the blood. We know that the blood was actually on the shroud before the image formed. And, of course, if you were trying to fake a medieval fake, if you were trying to fake this, you would find a way to create the image first, and you would add the blood later once you had the body image. You wouldn't try and form the body image around the blood that was already there. And yet that's exactly what we see on the cloth. We actually see that underneath the blood there is no image. So the image was actually formed around the blood, which is, I think, incredible. But I mean, that's another attribute of the Shroud of Turin which defies explanation.
Well, how could anyone even do that? And again, like and to be fair, just because I don't understand how someone could do something doesn't mean it's impossible. But by the same token, that specific example, I think, is really worth folks considering. So yeah, that's a good point.
I wish, I with all my heart, I wish that nobody is forcing anybody to believe that the Shroud of Turin is the burial cloth of Jesus, but it does exist. It's there. You can actually go and see it, and you can examine it, and it's a tangible physical object. And I wish that the Shroud's detractors could actually just stop trying to casually dismiss it as a medieval fake and actually try to work out how the image was formed, because there's nothing else like it on Earth. It had to have been formed somehow. And I must admit, I do spend some time on YouTube, and I'm looking at videos, and obviously you'll find videos of people denouncing the Shroud as a forgery, but they won't go to that. They won't answer that question. They won't answer the question, how was the image formed? They'll have their own preconceived ideas that, it couldn't possibly be a supernatural occurrence or anything like that, but they won't tell you how the image was formed. And I think that for scientists, that puzzles me. That really does. I can remember in 1988 when the Shroud was carbon dated, and of course this very sort of controversial carbon testing result, which came out, and the British Museum, of course, validated the results from the three laboratories, and Professor Edward Hall who was the in charge of the Oxford lab, was actually asked during the press conference, in which they very happily denounced it as a late medieval forgery. And Sir Edward Hall was actually asked, how did they make the image? And he said, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, he said, well, there was a big market for forgeries in the Middle Ages. Somebody went out, got a bit of linen, faked it up and flogged it. And I can remember thinking at the time, that just demonstrated such a lack of scientific curiosity. You know, for you just to think that somebody could just go along and fake it up and flog it. No, I'm sorry, but the more research that we've done on the image, the more, you know, curious we get. I mean, the latest result finding, which I'm sure is probably quite close, is that this was somehow this was a burst of light. This is what created the image. You know, there have been experiments done with ultraviolet light, but there aren't enough apparently ultraviolet light sources in the world to do a whole body image. But they have scientists working in Italy have actually managed to color, just slightly discolor a piece of linen by bombarding it with ultraviolet light, and that replicates ever so slightly the image, because that's all it is. It's just a slightly degraded, slightly sort of darkened part of the cloth that makes up the image. And so that seems to be the most logical, a possible explanation, the most likely. But again, it that also throws up more questions than it answers, because we have absolutely no idea how certainly a medieval forger could have actually got hold of that much ultraviolet light in order to be able to create that image. So again, it throws up more questions than it answers. But it's a fascinating field of study, and I wish that the scientific community could actually get involved in trying to find that out, because a lot of work is being done on it, and all of the work that is being done on it seems to be pointing more and more to it being simply impossible to replicate with even 21st century materials. Right. And for me, that seems to be a powerful indicator that what we're looking at here is something absolutely unique, absolutely extraordinary. And and certainly there is enough evidence to say that this is originating from the first century. You know,
it's interesting because I getting back to this, some of these other things you find out there, and I think it's good to, I don't want to say shop around, that's the wrong way to put it, but to watch, different perspectives and see, at least for argument's sake, what are some of the arguments being made, the counter arguments. And I was just watching some, I guess they're older, probably maybe 10 or 15 years now, some things that came up on YouTube and some of the hits that come up for just sort of Shroud in general. And one of them, I believe, was National Geographic or some sort of mainstream documentary that had come out years ago. And in that, I found it interesting because there's a section where, and I don't remember the gentleman's name, but if I can, folks can just search it on Google and see it, or on YouTube rather. But he says at one point that supposedly that the resurrection happens, and supposedly this image of Jesus is on this shroud, and he just sort of mentions in passing this very dismissive, like, oh, why would they mention that in the Gospels, right? And he just sort of dismisses it immediately as well. Therefore, it couldn't have happened because they would have mentioned that in the Gospel. And I just thought, you're making so many leaps to make a statement like that.
Yes.
That and look at it just comes across with such hubris sometimes that now what. You know how the gospel authors should have written the gospels. Like, what? It's good because right off the bat, I'm thinking to myself, well, Christianity is not exactly a highly favored thing in those first few decades, and it makes perfect sense to me why this is not something you would want to put out there for everybody to know. A little bit of discretion makes sense to me, especially if they don't understand how this happened. How do I have this?
Yeah, it is, and like I said, I think if people want to find fault or want to find reasons not to believe it, that's entirely their prerogative. And I mean, but as you say, I think to do so they have to make some increasingly big leaps, because certainly the history and the science is pointing in another direction. and that I think is what fascinates me. I mean, it's interesting. You mentioned the gospel. He mentions the gospel accounts. Well, all four gospel writers thought it was important to mention the linen shroud, and of course that also had a very big impact on the disciples, on Peter and John. In John's gospel, he actually describes how Peter and John, if you remember, run into the empty tomb.
Yep.
And of course,
I have the painting up here.
There we are.
the Eugene
that's right.
Bernon painting.
And of course, they look in, and the first thing that they see are the strips of linen lying there. And then Simon Peter goes into the tomb. He sees the strips of linen lying there. It says it again, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen, and then John goes in and he sees and believes. And I mean, what did John see in the empty tomb that made him believe that Jesus had risen from the dead? Well, certainly there must have been something about these empty strips of linen devoid of a body that made John believe immediately that Jesus had risen from the dead. And I have seen it very well sort of shown that the shroud, a lot of people don't know this, had a side strip that had been cut from it. And so when the shroud was actually being used as a burial cloth, this side strip would have been cut from the length of the linen. When Jesus would have then been laid on this thing, the side strip would have then been used to wrap around it, effectively wrapping the body into the cloth. And so the references to the strips of linen explain that after the resurrection, that side strip was then sewn back onto the cloth. And again, even that reveals some extraordinary evidence, which helps us to date it, because the side strip was expertly sewn back on. It's so well done that you've really got to look hard to be able to see the very faint line that divides it. But I promise you, it is there. Now, what's really, really interesting about that is that when the side strip was actually only removed recently, what had happened? Sorry, I'll start again. In the Middle Ages, they sewed a backing cloth onto the shroud to help.
Oh, right.
And that backing cloth wasn't actually removed until I think it was about 2002. And so for the very first time certainly in the modern sort of scientific era, we actually had an opportunity to peer behind and actually look at the underside of the Shroud of Turin, which we hadn't been able to do before because it had been sewn onto a medieval backing cloth. And what we found was extraordinary, that the seam was examined by a textile expert. And she said she had actually only seen that particular type of seam once before, and that was actually on in a first century Jewish settlement, which again is extraordinary. I mean, yeah. So you actually have this unique weave, this unique sort of seam, which is almost invisible on the one side, but on the back you can sort of see how it's been stitched together, and it's only been found on textiles in one place, and that was at Masada, which was a Jewish fortress which was actually overtaken by the Romans in AD 73 and never reoccupied. So you have something there that I think is incredibly another way of showing that this is a first century origin. No medieval forger would have gone to the time to try to replicate, even if he could, to actually try to replicate a stitching pattern that hadn't been used on non-Jewish textiles after the first century AD. There's no evidence that it's ever been used on non-Jewish textiles, and no evidence that it was ever used again after the first century. So again, you know, every little element of these things just marry up all the time.
Right.
It's all
well, let me ask you, Justin, about this connection too with the kind of back to the Grail lore here a bit too, because I'm going to link some stuff below because I've seen some stuff we probably don't have time to get into, but regarding some linguistic things that and I don't know all the details of that, but it sounds like there are very intriguing what's the word I'm looking for, proposals that have been made as far as how does this become specifically such a a British staple, right, with the Arthurian legend,
Oh,
and
yes. Yeah, yeah.
as I actually mentioned earlier in the part I recorded earlier about yes, there will be Monty Python references because I couldn't resist. No, but that does have such a centerpiece to that, and then a little bit later, as those myths develop, as you said, these different legends. You had mentioned off air beforehand that we could get in a little bit to the Veronica
Yes,
connection
yes.
potentially here, because I grew up Catholic. It's this, I believe, the sixth station of the cross, and a lot of people don't realize it isn't something mentioned in Scripture. She's not a character mentioned by name, so there is this tradition, but as you indicated, there might be more to it here that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the story of Veronica, I believe, didn't actually emerge until about the 14th century. And now, obviously, for the benefit of anybody who doesn't know who we're talking about here,
Mm-hmm.
the legend talks about a woman called Veronica who wiped Jesus' face with a veil as he was carrying his cross through Jerusalem on his way to be crucified. And when after he had wiped his face, she looked at the cloth and she saw that the veil had miraculously been imprinted with his face. And this is the legend, effectively, which began to emerge after the Edessa cloth, after the Mandylion had disappeared from Constantinople. And while the Mandylion was in Constantinople, obviously artists had gone and had made very reverent, holy copies of the face. They'd obviously been allowed to get close to it. They'd made copies of the face, very often, sometimes on cloth, sometimes on board, but very often after they had made their copies, they would then press them against the shroud in the hope, obviously, that its holiness would then become imbued with that. So after the sack of Constantinople and after the Mandylion had gone, there were sort of scattered around Christendom these very precious, very holy pictures showing the bearded face of Jesus. And I believe that the legend, the story of Veronica's veil was introduced to explain exactly where these stories had come from, where these pictures had come from. It's interesting, of course, that Jesus has to do it on the way to Golgotha because, of course, the face is blood-stained. We have the blood from the crown of thorns there. So in order to explain that, it had to be done on his way to crucifixion while he's carrying his cross. The other indication that we have that Veronica probably wasn't a real person is actually the name Veronica herself. The name didn't exist before the legend came about, and it's most likely a corruption of the words vera and icon. Vera is true, means true in Latin, and icon means image in Latin.
Mm-hmm.
So this was the true image. So I believe that the Veronica's veils that exist, and there are a few still that exist. There's one that's kept at the Vatican, and there's a few others as well. And I believe what these are medieval pictures of the Mandylion. Which are now called Veronica's veil for that purpose. And I think that that's a field of study in itself, but it's another example, I think, of how the Shroud story has actually spawned its own sort of myths and legends. And I think this is another one, which is obviously
Sure.
And I know, as you said, it is, as you say, still very much part of Catholic tradition. I know when Mel Gibson made his film The Passion of the Christ,
Yeah.
he actually included that scene, didn't he, where Jesus puts his face onto the cloth on his way. So although it's not mentioned in Scripture, I think it's I think this is another example of, if you like, finding stories to explain why this object being venerated in the cathedral is of such spiritual significance, is so holy.
Yeah. Well, and you had something too. You had mentioned earlier about more modern research, especially with this Templar connection, because, and you might, if you don't mind, maybe walk us through this. You know, a couple minutes left here. We could look at this here, but
Sure.
Just to summarize here, where do the Templars kind of come into the picture here? In respect to this time period of the Mandylion, again, if we're going for the purpose of argument here that the Edessa image is the shroud, how do the Templars come into play with this?
Yeah, I mean, if ever there was a group that could be entrusted with the task of protecting the shroud, it was probably the Knights Templar. I mean, the Knights Templar basically come on the scene in, I think it's 1119, 1118, 1119. And it's founded, the order is founded by a French knight. He called it the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ at the Temple of Solomon. And that's where they ended up calling themselves the Knights Templar. And they were set up, I think, with quite with very good intentions. After the Crusaders had captured Jerusalem in 1099, it became quite a popular tourist destination, with many European pilgrims going there to making sort of quite dangerous trips to the Holy Land. And unfortunately, of course, many of them ended up being robbed and murdered while they were out there. So this group set themselves up as protectors of the pilgrims going to the Holy Land. And initially, the group was treated with some suspicion by the church, but in 1139, they received the blessing of Pope Innocent II, and he granted them some special rights and privileges, such as not having to pay taxes. And they set up a network of banks, and they gained huge financial influence. Their banking system allowed pilgrims to deposit assets in their home countries and withdraw funds during their trip to the Holy Land. So, I mean, it worked out really, really well. And despite becoming fabulously wealthy, the knights themselves all swore an oath of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and were expected to live very holy lives. But at the height of their influence, they owned a fleet of ships. They owned the island of Cyprus, and they became the primary bank to European monarchs and nobility. And the order amassed such enormous wealth, they were even helping to finance wars from medieval European monarchs. And so this, I think, this was the order. They fabulously wealthy, or at least had a reputation for being fabulously wealthy, had a fantastic reputation for guarding and protecting treasures. When they fell out of favour, eventually they refused to finance Philip the Fair of France's wars, and so he conspired with the Pope and had them rounded up. And of course, the infamous date, if you remember, it was a dawn raid on the 13th of October, 1307, Friday the 13th.
Friday the 13th, yeah.
You get the story of the Friday the 13th. And on that day, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, Jacques de Molay, was arrested with about 60 knights, and they were accused of heresy. And among the many charges of heresy, they were accused of, quote, worshipping the image or head of a bearded man in secret ceremonies. And this is really, really interesting. It's this image of the head that they would worship. Now, as I said, there have been accounts that there's Vatican documents relating to the investigation of the activities of the Knights Templar have found an account of a Templar initiation rite in 1287. A young Frenchman is described that he saw the imprinted figure of a man and was told to worship it, kissing the feet 3 times. There's another confession that was pulled out of another Templar, which is really fascinating because it's talking about the head. And he said, and this was written down verbatim, this is by the interrogator, he said that the head had 4 feet, 2 at the front part of the face and 2 at the back. Now, that would have had them scratching their head with puzzlement, thinking, well, how can a head have 4 feet, 2 at the front part and 2 at the back? But, of course, when you look at the Shroud of Turin, it's pretty clear. The Shroud of Turin does show 4 feet because, of course, you're seeing the imprint of Jesus's front and back. So you're seeing the feet from the front and the feet from the back, exactly as this confession suggests. So,
like that mirrored kind of image, right?
That's correct. That's
right in the middle, right? Yeah.
And how could a head have 2 feet? Obviously, there must be it must be more than just the head. And so again, you get these tantalizing clues. Now, what's very interesting is that again they struggled in vain to identify this head, to find it, but the Templars didn't let on. Where they put it. Years of torture and imprisonment follows, but the authorities were unable to locate the whereabouts of this mysterious head. And eventually the King of France had Jacques de Molay burned at the stake in Paris. And alongside him, burning alongside him, was his deputy, a man called Geoffrey de Charny.
De Charny, yeah.
The Templar Draper, which is an interesting thing. They were burnt at stake in Paris on the 18th of March, 1314. And of course, the name de Charny becomes very, very important, because suddenly, when when the shroud that we know today is the Shroud of Turin surfaces, it's in the possession of the de Charny family. So again,
about 30 years after this, right?
So
Give or
yes,
take.
that's right. So basically, Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charny are burned at the stake in 1314, and then it's in 1350 that we get the first record by again another Geoffrey de Charny, a descendant of the man who had been burned at the stake, the Templar Knight, and he basically requests permission from Pope Clement VI to build a church in Leary to display the shroud of Christ that his family owned. Now, that's immediately denounced, and a lot of local sort of bishops get very upset. And one of them says that it's not the real shroud of Jesus, and it's a cunningly painted forgery. We know it's not painted, so we know that the bishop was lying when he said.
Well, that was his opinion, but not they weren't analyzing it scientifically, right? Yeah.
But this is the first. Obviously, it's Geoffrey de Charny requesting permission to actually build this and exhibit the shroud.
Right.
And that's the family, the de Charny family, always refused to say how they had acquired the shroud, and that obviously led to accusations that they had faked it. I mean, it was. But again,
well, or they had relatives. Well, they had relatives not long before this burned at the stake. That might be might be a simple explanation for why you might want to play that one close to the chest. It makes sense.
No, I think you could be right. So I think, and of course, it's this object that owned by Geoffrey de Charny, which then the de Charny family then sell it to the Savoy family, and it's the Savoys that bring it to Turin, and this is the object which is in Turin Cathedral today.
Right.
So you have this link. So you have this admittedly grey area for the shroud, which is this period of 100 and 150 years where its whereabouts are unknown. We have a few tantalising glimpses, and again, looking at these Templar initiation rites and things like that. This was obviously tied in very much with their initiation ceremonies. There was something there that was incredibly precious, very valuable, that appears to have incorporated not only a face but also feet as well, suggesting a full-length image. And of course, this is it's a little bit later then that the Grail legend begins to emerge as well. So you start sort of connecting the dots, and you can start to build quite an interesting case of what's happening here. I think from the sack of Constantinople, when this mysterious image disappears, right through to its resurfacing then in 1350 in the de Charny family. There's a very important correlation going on.
Well, and this is great, Justin. I think, and we're going to probably put a bow on it here just for now, and I'm sure that we'll continue on in the future. But too, like I said, I'm going to share a bunch of links below, for people to continue to dig deeper into this. And there's a great video I have linked below as well, interview from about 20 years ago or so with Dr. Dan Scavone, that Russ Brialt interviewed him on the Shroud Encounters YouTube channel, and that was very insightful as well and interesting. He really gets into the Gnostic Gospels and some of those extra biblical sources that start to trace these stories of Joseph of Arimathea and the Grail, the Shroud, and it's these parallels that are hard to ignore. So I that's truly fascinating.
You can go on forever. Talking about this. It was interesting, actually. You mentioned you just struck a chord with me. You mentioned how somebody was complaining that if the shroud was real, it would have been mentioned in the more specifically in the New Testament. I was, and again, this is why you can go on forever. A fascinating verse in Galatians, chapter 3, verse 1. Paul's letter to the Galatians, believed to have been written around 48 AD, where he is rebuking them for being led astray by false teaching. And he makes a rather interesting comment, and he actually says, quoting here from the NIV, "You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Before your very eyes, Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed as crucified." The NRSV puts it like this: "You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? It was before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly exhibited as crucified." Now, what's going on there? This is 20 odd years after the crucifixion and hundreds of miles away. What is Paul referring to here when he talks about them having clearly portrayed Jesus' crucifixion? They had seen something. If you go into the Greek words to crucify, the context implies that the Galatians would have seen the lasting results or the enduring effects of Jesus' crucifixion. But the verb translated clearly portrayed suggests vividly depicted or posted up in this context. It was, for example, a word that Greek writers would have used when they were posting an official notice or an
like on display, right?
In a public
Yes,
place for people to see. Bible scholars have struggled to interpret what Paul meant here. I mean, some people have suggested that Paul had preached to them with such skill that the audience could imagine that they were there when Jesus was crucified. But how could they have seen the crucified Jesus publicly exhibited with their own eyes? I mean, what did Paul show them? And you know, these are sort of tantalizing things. And as you said, I completely agree with you. I think that the early church, certainly in its formative years, would not have wanted to publicize the fact that the shroud existed. But I think there are little clues, perhaps, sort of peppered through the New Testament that there was something going on here. I mean, there's another one, again, which we could go on forever. But I know that in Paul's second letter to Timothy, which was written while Paul was in Rome, he asks Timothy to bring his cloak that he'd left in the Greek city of Troas. Now, that's always puzzled scholars, because why would Paul want a cloak taken about 1,600 kilometers across the world when he had plenty of opportunity and friends in Rome who could get him one immediately? Well, the ancient Greek word that's used for cloak doesn't actually mean cloak, coat, or warm garment. It's actually only used once in the Bible. The word actually means a long covering. It can also be used to mean something that carries information, leading some Bible scholars to wonder if it was a cloak lined with special pockets used to carry scrolls. But perhaps Paul deliberately picked the word because it had a double meaning. What was he really asking Timothy perhaps to bring him something, the long piece of fabric that bears information on it? Well, your guess is as good as mine. We don't know is the honest answer. But I mean, it is fascinating. It is, and I think that is again another mystery, isn't it? And I think that's one of the things that I love about the Shroud, because when you're interested in the Shroud, it can take you off in so many different tangents and so many different directions.
Well, it keeps us busy and interested.
Really
Yeah.
does. But it is quite honestly the gift that keeps on giving. It really is.
It is. It absolutely is. And Justin, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And the time difference here. I know it's late. Getting late where you're at.
Oh, that's fine. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
No, but I definitely want to have you back on again. We'll catch up soon for sure.
Lovely.
And
look forward to it.
God bless you.
Thank you. Take care.
Well, he's absolutely right. Again, it's the gift that keeps on giving, and I am, as always, very honored and blessed to be able to spend some time and a good chunk of time on this channel now devoting to this question of the Shroud and looking at it from a couple different angles here, different perspectives, focusing on different aspects of the evidence that's there, and trying to think through it, trying to see where we can get with it. And I hope you enjoyed it. I'm sure you did. So thank you guys so much. Please feel free to leave some comments down there. If you have any other Shroud-related guests you'd like to see on here, or some material you want to share with me to check out, I'd really appreciate that. As always, you can check me out over at thegraciousguest.org, which is my main website. That's the best way to really get in touch with me and direct message me on there. You can see all of my other material over there, a little bit more about some writing that I'm doing right now as well. And as always, thank you guys for stopping by The Gracious Guest Show. Until next time, don't forget to wonder. Take care.